Hi, I'm Tom. This video is going to take a detailed look at Schubert's Wanderer Fantasy Deutsch 760. We're going to look at the motivic content, the formal structure, the harmony, and most importantly how all of these elements interact to create a compelling musical narrative. This is one of my favourite works of all time, so I'm really looking forward to this. Let's get started. The piece begins by diving straight into the first theme, the thrusting, energised entry of a musical protagonist clearly determined to be the hero of their own life, a theme we will call the heroic theme. Famously, the opening gesture of this theme, which we're going to call the Wanderer figure, forms the basis for the entirety of what follows. No subsequent bar will pass without some kind of reference to the elements that go to make it up, so it's important to look at these in some detail. We begin with this assertive double forte figure consisting of C major chords in a long, short rhythmic configuration, often referred to as a dactyl rhythm. This C major harmony then fans out in a semiquaver arpeggio figure, leading up to a reiteration of the dactyl rhythm, outlining a semitone rise from B to C. This semitone rise is then echoed a tone higher, the C sharp, an accented passing note, elaborating a G7 chord to create an upward scale, while leaping octave Gs sound in the bass. As if to emphasize the importance of this opening gesture, Schubert immediately repeats it with slight variations on different pitches, this time moving from chord 5 back to chord 1, C major. The sentence then continues with a series of phrases exploring these melodic and rhythmic elements in a variety of ways. The semiquaver arpeggio, the dactyl rhythm, the step motion, this time inverted, the octave leaps, which are also transformed into a distinctively new idea, namely a rocking down and up motion by leap. For me, this piece can be heard as a kind of musical Bildungsroman, a class of novel that depicts and explores the manner in which the protagonist develops morally and psychologically. The German word Bildungsroman means novel of education or novel of formation. In the same way, the Wanderer Fantasy can be heard as depicting the coming-of-age story of a musical protagonist, the equivalent of the psychological and moral development being the cumulative variation and interaction of the motivic elements that go to make up the musical fabric. So when we first meet our protagonist in this heroic theme, they're callow, full of naive confidence, bravado and uncomplicated diatonic harmonies. By the time we come to the final theme, the Fugato theme, several hundred bars later, our protagonist will be a far more complex personality. We have dissonant diminished seventh melodic leaps, contrapuntal complexity, ambivalent chromatic harmonies. In short, we have a musical character that is lived. This is the classic character arc of any Bildungsroman, and as we'll see, this journey from callow ingenue bucking societal norms to an older and wiser self will touch on the same narrative landmarks characteristic of the genre. To be clear, I don't mean this programmatically. We're not going to be trying to map musical events onto a specific literary narrative, nor am I suggesting that Schubert sat down and thought, I'm going to write the equivalent of a Bildungsroman now. But the formal shapes of stories are universal, and Schubert did set out to write a piece using cumulative thematic development and growth, and to shape this with the ebb and flow and the conflict and resolution of a narrative. This is a story told in purely musical terms, through thematic development, motivic transformation, and unexpected harmonic twists and turns. And the first, and perhaps most important, of these harmonic shifts comes at the end of this opening sentence, in the form of this tremolo, which starts with a drop to piano and then lurches us to a double forte cadence on an E major chord, the chromatic mediant, the major chord on the third note of a major key, and a key that is harmonically very distant from the home key of C major. Embedded in this first theme, then, is an inherent restlessness, a seeking of something beyond C major and the closely related keys to which we'd normally be expected to modulate at this point. It seems there's more to our protagonist than those simple, straightforward C major harmonies might have suggested. This is a protagonist inwardly rebelling against the traditional conventions of sonata form and key relationships, a protagonist who wants to strike out on their own as soon as the opportunity arises to do so. This tremolo will play a fundamental role throughout the piece, as will the harmonic shift by the distance of a third. And there's also another crucial element introduced in this final 4 bars of the opening sentence, and that's the means by which we get from the tremolo to the cadence onto the E major chord, namely this augmented 6th chord, and the semitone movement intrinsic to its resolution. The augmented 6th is created after we move chromatically to what looks like another secondary dominant structure, but instead of completing the chromatic scale all the way from F sharp to F sharp, we come to hang on the F natural, the base of the augmented 6th chord. It's called an augmented 6th because of the raised 6th interval between the root note, F, and D sharp, and Schubert emphasizes the importance of the first appearance of this chord by hammering it repeatedly, double forte. Note that at first it's the plain augmented 6th, known as the Italian 6th, meaning that the only other note involved is the third of the chord. But Schubert then also adds the augmented 4th to create a French 6th. The augmented 6th interval, which by definition resolves outwards by semitone, the harmonic expression of that semitone motif from bars 2 and 3, will, throughout the work, play the role of a kind of portal to another harmonic universe, a means of slipping past stultifying harmonic convention in search of more rarefied air, a kind of musical equivalent to Evelyn Waugh's Low Door in one of the greatest Bildungsromane ever written, Brideshead Revisited.
I went there uncertainly, for it was foreign ground, and there was a tiny, priggish, warning voice in my ear which, in the tones of Collins, told me it was seemly to hold back. But I was in search of love in those days, and I went full of curiosity and the faint, unrecognized apprehension that here at last I should find that low door in the wall others I knew had found before me, which opened on an enclosed and enchanted garden which was somewhere, not overlooked by any window, in the heart of that grey city.
If you haven't read Brideshead Revisited or seen the BBC series, I highly recommend both, by the way. This augmented 6th, then, is the glimpse of a road less travelled, a path to new horizons embodied in that E major chord that our protagonist appears to be seeking. So now that Schubert has introduced the principal character of the work and introduced the elements of their musical personality, elements that will shape and be shaped by the musical events to follow, Schubert now needs to set the musical narrative in motion, and this he does harmonically. After the pause following the unexpected E major chord, we snap back immediately to C major with a repetition of the opening dactyl motif, a shift brought about by another of those semitone shifts we mentioned, G sharp slipping down a semitone and the B up a semitone. This time the dactyl motif is double piano rather than double forte, with light staccato markings, and the rest of the figure is no longer staccatissimi as it was the first time around. Our wanderer seems unsure how to respond to this E major impulse, caught in two minds. Instead of the two-beat rest that followed the wanderer figure in the opening sentence, we get this plaintive echo of the G7 chord. As in the first sentence, we get a repetition of the wanderer figure moving from dominant to tonic, this time again less assured and followed by that plaintive echo. We get the arpeggio motif, the step motif over the octave leap, the plaintive chord, the same again in sequence. And now we seem to be summoning up our strength and growing in confidence, double forte again, a series of arpeggios, versions of the step motif, elements of the up and down motif, and then the entry onto the stage of another vital recurring member of this musical cast, a double forte diminished chord. This diminished chord is the catalyst we've been waiting for. It acts similarly to what writers call the inciting incident, the decision or encounter or revelation or event that sets off the chain of cause and effect that forms the narrative of the drama. It's the moment of the assertion of the will, the moment at which our protagonist decides to answer the call of that median E major chord and take their first steps into the unknown. Usually this moment, this inciting incident, is a microcosm of the conflict at the heart of the drama. And in this case, the conflict is clear. Schubert's working within a very well-defined tradition of sonata form, and he knows that his listeners, having heard the first theme in the tonic C major, will be expecting and waiting for a second theme in the dominant key, G major. The conflict then is between the forces of common practice harmony, expecting us to follow the traditional path through the usual keys, in this case G major, and the efforts of our protagonist to escape the conventional and explore instead a road less travelled. At first it looks as if this attempt to break free from the conventional path is succeeding, as on the page Schubert changes the B flat to its enharmonic equivalent A sharp. This implies the leading note seventh of B minor, and the A sharp does indeed rise to B natural in the bass as we would expect. But the chord above the B is not B minor, but G major, the leading note chord, thus resolving to chord 6 of B minor. When we hear the B in the bass rise to C to create an A minor chord, the 2 of G major, it seems clear that we're now being pulled back to the traditional key of G major. This impression is made even stronger when the bass rises a further step to D, and Schubert gives us a classic cadential 6/4 formulation to the dominant 7th of G. All roads seem to lead to G major then, however much our musical protagonist might wish otherwise, and this sense of closing in on the inevitable is strengthened by the way the outer lines come together as if to converge on a single destination, the bass rising as we've seen, and the upper line evoking the step motif with a series of appoggiaturas and suspensions. But then, our protagonist once again summons the force of their will in the form of that rebellious double forte diminished chord, and pulls us away from the expected arrival in G. The tug of war begins again as we follow the same course as before, varying our root slightly, here the A sharp still rising to B, but the sonority above now outlining a passing E minor chord in second inversion rather than G, but still taking us to that A minor chord again, the 2 of G major. And now the same chord progression as last time is stretched out, the 6/4 chord lasting a full bar rather than the original 2 beats, the suspension prolonged, and we hang on the dominant 7th for a full bar while the upper voice embellishes the F sharp with this beautiful turn-like structure that seems to push our protagonist to the conventional G major resolution with this closing perfect cadence. Our protagonist's attempt to stray from the beaten track appears to have been thwarted. Except there remains that low door we discussed earlier. If you remember, within that augmented 6th chord resolution was a semitone movement that took us from C major to a cadence on an E major chord. Now, as we hang on this B, fully expecting to continue in G major, we seem to find that door, and with a series of those characteristic semitone movements, first up, then down, we slip not into G major, but to E major, and we find ourselves in that enclosed and enchanted garden, the light and graceful E major 2nd theme, a theme we'll call the lyric. The lyric theme begins with a variation of the wanderer figure that began the piece. We have the dactyl motif, followed by the semitone rise, which is now decorated to create a variation of the up and down motif, also echoed in the bass. Note that this up and down motif is a retrograde, backwards version of the dactyl rhythm. As in the heroic theme, this gesture is then sequenced, repeated on different scale degrees. And then the 4th leap from the heroic's subsequent phrase is filled in with an E major scale, and then again in the opposite direction, while the dactyl rhythm and up and down motif are evoked in the left hand, taking us to the end of the first sentence of this 2nd theme. A diminuted version of the semitone drop that led us into the lyric theme then takes us into a modified repeat of the first phrase, up an octave and with an elaboration of the up and down echo in the bass. This time, however, the harmony shifts. In the 2nd figure, C sharps are replaced by C naturals, and the G sharp by G natural, thus replacing E major with E minor. The 2nd half of the sentence proceeds in a series of gestures based on the inverted stepwise motion, and formed of versions of the various motifs we've encountered so far. Notice particularly how Schubert takes this semi-quaver idea, which is derived from the up and down motif, and then augments it to quavers before extending the phrase by repeating the same gesture down a step. We then come to this third sentence, which acts like a kind of coda to the lyric theme. There's a version of the lyric theme's opening gesture in the bass, which then continues with an inversion of that filled-in fourth interval from the continuation of the theme's first sentence. An inverted version of the chromatic linking gesture then takes us into the second part, consisting of the up and down motif and that filled-in fourth again. Meanwhile, in the right hand, we have a counterpoint dominated by the re-emerging dactyl rhythm. Like the bass, it's built around the up and down motif and the three-note scale groupings which Schubert subtly prepared in the preceding accompaniment and includes exact pitch imitations between the two hands. This coda to the second theme takes us gradually out of the minor modes to round off the theme in E major again. And then something interesting happens. The ground slips from under our E major feet by means of this D natural in the bass. This creates an E7 chord, the dominant chord of the A keys, implying that we're about to shift to A minor. A minor is the relative minor of C major and therefore a very conventional key to move to at this point. Once again, the forces of tradition appear to be attempting to bring our protagonist back into line with their expectations, and of course this immediately reawakens that restless and rebellious instinct embodied in the tremolo motif, which manages to hold off A minor by slipping into C major and summoning strength in the form of the heroic theme. But now the heroic theme is perhaps not as heroic as it had imagined itself to be in the opening bars. It appears discombobulated this time. The double forte chords are 2 octaves higher, the arpeggio motif played in reverse, and the semitone dactyl motif moved to the bass 2 octaves lower. The reply on the dominant G7 chord follows the same out-of-joint pattern, and even as the theme seems to find its footing, the continuation proceeding more or less as it did at the opening of the piece, we find ourselves pulled dramatically into A minor, precipitated again via the turning of G natural to G sharp. As well as being the relative minor of C major, A minor is also a third below the tonic, so this counter-revolution against the shift to E major, a third up from the tonic, acts as a kind of mirror reflection, an equal and opposite reaction that causes the previously gentle lyric theme to erupt into a stormy double forte version in the bass, punctuated by the minim echoes that had previously interspersed the heroic theme, and accompanied in the right hand by semiquaver scales derived from the 2+4 rhythm of the heroic's arpeggio motif, focusing on the groups of 4. What follows is our protagonist's struggle to hold on to whatever it is the lyric theme represents, and resist the pull of A minor. The Sturm und Drang of this conflict is brilliantly captured in the way that Schubert emphasizes the semitone motif, building tension by rising through a scale based on those same semitone motions, leading to the melody and accompaniment stumbling over one another, the lyric theme now in the right hand and the heroic's scales in the left, as everything inverts, the scales sweeping up instead of down, the up and down motif moving down then up, the minim interjections low instead of high, the dactyl gesture repeated down rather than up a step, while the whole structure is controlled by a downward scale instead of an upward one, as we decrescendo to this quiet continuation phrase, a third version of the various continuations of the lyric theme. This final variation of the continuation phrase emphasizes a dotted version of the dactyl rhythm together with the step motif. The quiet gesture seems to suggest a weakening of resolve in the face of the underlying A minor harmonies, but this resolve is then immediately re-summoned in the form of these double forte up and down motifs from the lyric theme, which sequence up the same scale with a very different, far more defiant response, decorated as before with a semiquaver pattern based around the semitone step motif. These two responses wrestle one another one more time before we come to this dramatic B-flat dominant 7th chord, the B-flat being the culmination of the rising scale in the bass. The scale that follows this dramatic B-flat dominant chord is of course a version of the scale that began the struggle with A minor, and it's fitting that it's the same scale which ends it. This time it is a major scale, E-flat major, that descends to that semiquaver turn structure, which was earlier derived from the up and down motif, if you remember. This morphs back to the up and down motif, first in triplets and then in a reverse dactyl rhythm, and brings us to the third and final theme of this movement, what I'm going to call the pastoral theme, a place of respite and calm after the frantic energy of the preceding section. Our hero has, for the time being at least, evaded the pull of A minor, and is instead settled on another distant and unconventional key, up a third from the tonic, E-flat major. I've called this the pastoral theme because its leisurely harmonic turnover and repetitious motivic usage remind me very much of the kinds of techniques used in 19th century music to depict the countryside, the most famous example being Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. It's a theme that wears its motivic and harmonic derivation on its sleeve. In the left hand we have a simple, arpeggiated accompaniment derived from the Wanderer figure that opened the heroic theme, which outlines the same alternations of tonic and dominant, chord 1 and chord 5, that we saw at the equivalent point in the heroic and lyric, underpinned by a gentle heartbeat in the bass, like orchestral string plucks. In the right hand we have the reverse dactyl version of the up and down motif, coupled with the scale motif. This melodic formulation of the reverse dactyl up and down notes followed by a 3-note scale also of course began the first continuation of the lyric theme, as well as forming an important part to its codetta. And it's clear that the pastoral theme is an extension, a semitone away harmonically, of that metaphorical enchanted garden first encountered in the lyric. Traditionally, the lyric and pastoral themes are often collectively referred to as the second subject area. The only real melodic variety comes from the direction of the scale motif, as the theme steadily climbs to this high point before descending down a sequence in thirds as we modulate to A-flat major, for another shorter variation of the theme in that key. Again, a key harmonically a third away from the tonic key of C. The overall effect is one of relaxation, a sense of unhurried calm, of lying back in the grass and listening to the babbling of the stream, the wind in the trees, the sounds of nature. These are the halcyon days, an idyll that will pass and never be found again, but which for the moment feels eternal. The idyllic scene is suddenly interrupted by the explosive, varied return of the heroic theme, now in the key of D-flat major. The manner of arrival of this key, forte after a decrescendo from pianissimo, gives it an emphasis we need to pay attention to. D-flat is just a semitone from the tonic, C, and as we've observed throughout this movement, these semitone relationships are fundamental to the structure of the work as a whole. This is the first time we've heard the heroic theme in a key that is not the tonic, and in fact, it's the last time we will ever hear it. The story of this final section is the disintegration of the seeming Arcadia at the heart of this first movement. However hard they may try to hold on, our protagonist is no longer the C major tyro we met in the opening theme, and they never can be again. Instead, this is a changed and changing character, a more complex one. Thus, after the blasts of the dactyl motif and extended versions of the arpeggio motif, we proceed not to the simple tonic-dominant alternations that previously defined the heroic theme, but instead drop down in thirds, coming to this chromatic Neapolitan chord on E double flat. A Neapolitan chord is a chord based on the flattened second of a key, which is of course an all-important semitone. So the second degree of D flat is of course E flat, and so the flattened second is E double flat. At the heart of this version of the heroic theme then is a Neapolitan wound, one that will become the central preoccupation of the next movement. Neapolitan chords tend to progress to the dominant, as it does here. Note this rather fiddly accidental, by the way, with the natural and flat side by side. This is to emphasize that one of the flats of the double flats has been removed, so that we now only have E single flat. The false relation between these two notes is part of the characteristic expressive sound of the Neapolitan, and the semitone difference is a signal that we're approaching another of those semitone shifts we first encountered in the augmented sixth at the end of the first sentence, a prospect Schubert further highlights with these stepwise oscillations in the semiquaver material. Schubert repeats this Neapolitan gesture to firmly establish it in our ears, then makes an enharmonic switch on the same bass notes, G flat now spelt as F sharp, and E double flat now spelt as D natural. The G flat major chord switches mode from major to minor, giving us an F sharp minor chord that leads to the exact enharmonic equivalent of the Neapolitan chord, D major. By switching the spelling in this way, Schubert's indicating that we're shifting away from D flat major, firstly towards G major, and then through a sequence based on this lyric-derived idea. Dactyls, followed by a step, followed by this diminuted, compressed dactyl rhythm, accompanied by stepwise oscillations that shift the bass up a step to finish on an octave leap. The sequence moves down in steps and fragments into ever smaller parts, the octaves morphing into the dotted rhythm first introduced in the Pastoral theme, a modified dactyl that Schubert is planting in our mind's ear because he knows it's going to become important later on. With the return of the augmented sixth chord, in this case an Italian sixth on A flat, the central conflict of this section becomes clear. Augmented sixth chords are commonly based on the flat sixth note of a key, and A flat is of course the flattened sixth of C major. This time then, it's the tonic key that is trying to pull us home through the augmented sixth doorway and set us back on the conventional path. The augmented sixth resolves outwards as usual to the G chord, the dominant of C. We repeat a variation of what we've just heard, this time with the upper and lower parts exchanging positions, the semiquavers in the right hand and the dactyl in the left, and the stepwise drop further elaborated with another semitone dactyl movement that leads to an evocation of the arpeggio idea incorporating the scale motif. We have arrived on a G chord, the dominant of the C keys, and the prolongation of this harmony by alternation with A flat chords, yet another semitone relationship, suggests that the battle is lost, that we are heading back to the home key of C, even if possibly C minor rather than C major. We hang on the dactyl rhythm, an ominously weakening pulse, but then we respell the A flat as a G sharp, and summon that willfulness embodied in the diminished seventh chord, the chord that set us off on our journey at the beginning of the movement. This precipitates a series of sforzando interjections that initially seem to be taking us to the very distant key of F sharp minor. But as we pass through a G sharp major chord, it turns out we have found a new door, one just to the side of the A flat augmented sixth that would have led to C, another augmented sixth, a semitone away on A. This strongly implies a turn towards C sharp minor, with G sharp the dominant of C sharp minor, and the French sixth built on the flat sixth. This dominant harmony is prolonged with implied echoes of the augmented sixth and secondary dominants, right up to the end of the movement, which finishes with one last reminder of the importance of the semitone, a neighbour note movement up to A, and back down to G sharp, derived of course from the up and down motif. This neighbour note idea is a harbinger of the next theme, as we'll see. The G sharp dominant seventh then finally resolves onto a C sharp minor chord, and we begin the second movement Adagio in the very distant key of C sharp minor. As is often the case in a Bildungsroman, after a first section depicting the enclosed and enchanted garden in full sunlit bloom, we find ourselves for the next part in the same garden gone to seed. The Adagio movement lies at the expressive core of the fantasy. It's a set of variations on this 8-bar theme. These are the 8 bars that Schubert lifted from his song The Wanderer, and upon which the entire fantasy is based, hence its posthumous designation as the Wanderer fantasy. We're not taking a programmatic approach to this piece, but I do think it's impossible to ignore the fact that this is a melody from a song, and one of Schubert's most popular songs at the time, and would therefore be associated with specific lyrics in the mind of the composer and the audience, or at the very least a specific mood. So I do think it's worth taking a look at the song here. The song is through composed, meaning that each verse has a different melody. The first verse introduces the wanderer protagonist, their silent, joyless wanderings through the landscape, and the central question that they ask themselves: where? In the second verse, the wanderer bemoans his current depressive condition, a sense of alienation from a world that seems faded and lifeless. In the next two verses, the wanderer describes a place he's trying to get to, a place he's never been to, but that he imagines is full of colour and hope, with friends, without grief, a land where he is understood and can make himself understood. In other words, happiness.
Wo bist du, mein geliebtes Land, gesucht, gehasst und nie gekannt.
It's to this elusive place that the question at the heart of the poem, where, refers. Finally, in the last verse we return to the latter couplet of the first verse, a snap back to the bleak reality of the current situation. And in the closing lines, the central question is finally answered. There where you are not is happiness. It's the melody of the second verse that Schubert has taken as the basis for the Wanderer fantasy, the verse that depicts the wanderer's alienation and near despair. And if we compare this verse with the opening 8 bars of the Adagio, we'll hear that they are pretty much the same. Expressively then, our musical protagonist has reached the nadir. This movement is a meditation on loss. The loss of the second subject area, the loss of the protagonist's image of themselves as hero, and the self-imposed loss of their C major home. All of these factors are brilliantly encapsulated in the choice of the new key of C sharp minor. The alienation is emphasized by having a key that is simultaneously both extremely distant from C major and itself an inflection of the note C. It's also the relative minor of the all-important E major key, the key of the lyric, and the key that first set us on this journey. Thirdly, C sharp is enharmonic to D flat, the key in which the forever changed heroic theme returned at the end of the first movement, and it is the key built on the semitone above the tonic, that is, the Neapolitan key, a harmonic shift that was foreshadowed, as we discussed, by that Neapolitan wound embedded in the final iteration of the heroic theme. Motivically, it's easy to see the elements Schubert took from this to create the opening wanderer figure and the themes that follow it, particularly the lyric. The dactyl rhythm, the semitone rise, the first of which is the G sharp to A neighbour note movement anticipated at the very end of the preceding movement. The inversion of this semitone motion in the bass, the scale, the semiquaver linking motif, and the up and down motif. It's extraordinary to think that from just these 8 bars, Schubert has conjured up a piece 720 bars long, a rich and complex dramatic narrative unfolding over 20 minutes in performance. After a simple statement of the desolate Adagio theme, we modulate to the relative major of C sharp minor, namely E major, for the first variation. It is of course significant that this first variation is in E major, the key that represents what has been lost, the object of the Adagio theme's brooding rumination. This movement, characterized harmonically by the alternations of major and minor, always sounds to me like a dialogue between two voices or two states of mind, one bleak and desolate, and the other consoling and nostalgic. Hence this first variation is a beautiful and melancholy meditation on the theme, reminiscent in style to the slow movement of Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, motivated primarily by these gently undulating evocations of the stepwise motif, but also with hints of the arpeggio idea, the scale motif, and the up and down motif that characterized both the lyric theme and the pastoral. For the second variation, we slip back through that augmented sixth on A to C sharp minor reality, falling deeper into the darkness, the step motif growling in the bass. Now, after the rumbling of the approaching clouds, the storm breaks. The dactyl rhythm comes apart, the short element seeming to become uncoupled from the long. Then it reconfigures as the retrograde version, and then again returns to its original form. Our protagonist seems to be banging on the augmented sixth door through which they came, looking for a route out of C sharp minor. That struggle comes to hover on the leading note harmony of C sharp minor, which then moves to the dominant harmony of the C sharp keys. And then, in a sublime Schubertian shift that takes us completely by surprise, we drop not into C sharp minor, but into the parallel major key. And we get this beautiful, consoling third variation, with the major third and major sixth, giving a sense of at least temporary release from our C-sharp minor burdens. The second phrase switches back to C-sharp minor, E and A naturals returning, and begins to grow restless in the left hand, with the short element of the dactyl rhythm alternating with the semitone rise. We seem to be reaching harmonically for the memory of E major, just as the original theme did. But now it is fading, and we're unable to hold on, the E slipping down a semitone to D sharp to create a G sharp 7, the dominant of the C sharp keys. And we shift once again to C sharp major for the fourth variation. The first part of the fourth variation is underpinned by plucked arpeggios in the bass, and motivated by gentle oscillations of the prevailing chord. The end of the first phrase reintroduces the A natural via the G sharp to A neighbour note motion that characterised the Adagio theme, to take us into C sharp minor again for the second phrase. The oscillating accompaniment continues, and now Schubert moves from variations driven by the melodic structure to a more harmonically based variation process, the kind of writing we might see in a figuration prelude or an etude perhaps, the right hand devolving into gorgeous inverted scale motifs and step motions, as the second phrase once again reaches for E major, but is suddenly pulled dramatically back to C sharp minor, and thrown into a passage that shakes off the Adagio theme altogether in an explosion of angry defiance, a passage we will call an episode. After repeating this downward scale line in successive octaves, our musical protagonist seems to summon up the will to fight on, and they do so, no surprises, in the form of that diminished seventh assertion of the will, outlined with this very distinctive bass line. The D sharp then slips down to D natural to produce an inverted augmented sixth type structure on D, the flat second of C sharp minor, the Neapolitan. This Neapolitan is then tonicized via its dominant A7, as the bass line takes us through another augmented sixth interval, this time one that acts like an augmented sixth on the flat sixth of E major, namely C. But that door is of course closed now, and this pattern then repeats, sequencing up in steps, as if we are pushing at random at any potential way out. Note by the way how the notation briefly slips onto the flat side with E flat 7 and A flat instead of D sharp and G sharp. This could just be for ease of reading, but I suspect Schubert is also deliberately signalling the upcoming modulation to A flat major, the key of the next movement. The sequence then dissolves into another by beginning as per the model, and then forming into a new pattern that then continues the ascending stepwise sequence before drilling into the step motif and returning us to that 4-note idea. The next stop in the sequence would be F sharp, but the dominant preparation is prolonged through crashing assertions of the diminished 7th chord, as our protagonist seems to rage against the inevitable, like King Lear shouting into the wind, refusing to give in. Eventually we do come to the expected F sharp minor chord. This is the subdominant, the 4 chord of C sharp minor, and we then move to the dominant, suggesting that for all our histrionics and defiance, we're not going to escape C sharp minor after all. But instead of C sharp minor, we drop again into C sharp major, and we enter what we'll call a final variation of sorts, because it does return us to material that's recognisably thematic, but it should be said that it's fairly loose in its relation to the original theme. The first and most important thing to notice in this last variation is that the 4-note motif has now morphed to give us a 5-note structure with a semitone followed by an arpeggio. This is important because it will become an integral feature of the next movement. Above this we get the significant return of the tremolo motif, a pianissimo oscillation between the minor 7th and the flat 9, the restless curiosity and thirst for life embodied in the tremolo idea seems to be re-emerging. Harmonically, the tremolo suggests a move towards F sharp minor, the minor subdominant, as it ushers in a version of the Adagio theme's opening gesture over an unstable, diminished harmony. We stay in C sharp major, however, despite the A natural in the melody as part of the semitone upper neighbour note motif. Semitone neighbour note movements are also emphasised in the bass, before morphing back into a version of the 5-note upward semitone followed by an arpeggio idea that we just noted. This insistence on the upward semitone continues, as finally we brighten, and with the recollection of that turn-like structure that took us into the lyric theme in the first movement, we are at last able to stay with the memory of E major, and make our peace with what has been left behind. Our period of mourning appears to be over, but the question now is, where do we go next? Have we had enough of wandering? Are we ready to return to the conventional harmonic world we left behind? Or do we continue to buck the trend in search of a life less ordinary? As we enter a short coda, the answer appears to be the former. As the left hand ruminates on that 5-note upper semitone and arpeggio pattern, the E chords begin to alternate with A minor chords. This is ambivalent. Are we in E major with the A minor triads acting as the chromatic minor 4, or perhaps even as the upper extensions of a B7? Or are we shifting to A minor with E, the dominant of A minor? Either way, it's clear that A minor is threatening again. The last time we confronted A minor was when it dragged us away from the lyric and we escaped to the pastoral. Once again here, A minor as the relative minor of C major would represent the conventional harmonic path out of this point of crisis and back towards home. And in the performance we're listening to, this A minor harmonic tendency is strengthened further by the flattening of the D sharp to D natural to create an E dominant 7th, right at the cusp of the upcoming third movement. And the D natural makes sense given what happens next. We've seen this E7 before, of course, at the end of the lyric. This was the chord that first attempted to drag us away from the lyric and into A minor, and it seems to be playing the same game here. But just as at the end of movement 1 we thought we were heading towards C major, and then turned the corner to find ourselves a semitone higher in C sharp minor, here Schubert plays a similar trick. This time we turn the corner to find ourselves not in the expected A minor, but a semitone lower, in A flat major. Again, a third away from the tonic C, and a highly unusual key for a movement in a C major work. It appears our Bildung, our education or formation, is not yet complete. Just as it seemed our journey of self-discovery was at an end, we've slipped through another of those low doors. If we return to the final bar of the slow movement, the significance of that D natural, which seemed to create an E7, is now clear, because an E7 can be reinterpreted enharmonically as a German 6th on F flat, the flat 6 of A flat major. Once again, the augmented 6th has come to the rescue, and that 5-note idea, murmuring ruminatively in the bass, is transformed into this impish double forte idea with an accent on the first beat. For me, this Presto movement is the most extraordinary movement in the Fantasy, and one of the most remarkable and original movements that Schubert ever wrote, because in it he achieves the remarkable feat of presenting themes that are simultaneously old and new, themes that are both recapitulations of themes from the first movement, as well as being self-standing melodies in their own right. The Presto theme, for example, is in fact a triple-time variation of the duple-time heroic theme. After a 2-bar introduction consisting of that semitone rise and arpeggio with perhaps a hint of the up and down motif, we launch into a version of the dactyl rhythm from the Wanderer figure that started the heroic theme. And then this first phrase is rounded off with arpeggios followed by that semitone rise, the whole phrase shifting, as in the heroic, from tonic to dominant. After a transitional bar that functions much like an arpeggiated version of the minim interjections in the original heroic theme, we get an answering phrase made up of the same thematic elements, which takes us back to the A-flat tonic, again shadowing the heroic theme. Finally, another transitional bar takes us into the continuation, which begins with a sequence alternating the dactyl rhythm with the movements opening 4 quavers in a crotchet pattern, then moves to a further sequence based on semitone movements that leads us, as in the heroic theme, to the all-important tremolo, that moment when in the heroic the augmented sixth sent us lurching unexpectedly away from C major towards that E major chord. This entire section is simply the same music down a semitone, with the augmented sixth this time resolving not to E major but a semitone lower, to E flat. This shift to E flat major is conspicuous by the fact that it is not a shift to C major. If we were following the path of the heroic theme exactly, we would be going to the chromatic mediant of the movement's key, which in the case of A flat is C. It's a clear signal that our protagonist is still not yet ready to return to the home key of C major, that their urge to roam, embodied in the tremolo motif, remains as strong as ever. After this augmented sixth shift, we return, just as in the heroic, to the starting key and repeat the first main phrase, pianissimo, and then the Presto theme, more or less exactly, until we get to the continuation. Again, this mirrors the structure of the opening theme at first, with runs derived from the arpeggio motif, followed by a step motif and then a minim, repeated in sequence. The sequence fragments into smaller units, and then we return again to the tremolo, which leads once more to that augmented sixth, again coming to rest on an E-flat major chord. The bass enters with double forte dactyl motifs on the minor seventh of the E-flat major chord, implying E-flat dominant seventh. And then, just as we did at this point in the heroic, we summon up the diminished seventh chord in the form of arpeggios. The pitches of this diminished chord are in fact the very same pitches of the diminished chord that began the equivalent passage in the first movement, only spelt differently. This was the episode that took us into the lyric theme, and the same pattern is followed here, with the diminished episode leading into the second theme of the movement, as we'll see in a moment. So what's going on here? Why is Schubert retracing his steps? Why are we following the same thematic course and revisiting the same landmarks? Well, I think Schubert is inviting us to view the musical landscape of the first movement from a different perspective, a perspective now shaped by the experiences of the second movement Adagio and the events that led up to it. It's like that moment in a Bildungsroman when the protagonist goes back, when they return to the scene of those formative experiences that were so transformative at the time, and view them through a clearer, wiser lens. Thus, rather than the heroic figure they'd imagined themselves to be in the heroic theme, they see instead the skittish and immature character embodied in the Presto theme. Next in the first movement came the enchanted garden of the second subject area, the lyric and the pastoral. Now the question is whether our protagonist can recapture those past glories. First up then is the search for the lyric theme. With an emphasis on the Presto version of the dactyl motif, we head for a cadence of sorts in C-flat major, a repetition of the unstable diminished part of the preceding phrase down a tone, and then we come to a definitive arrival in C-flat major. This time there is no augmented sixth or semitone doorway, no struggle against forces attempting to pull us into C-related keys. Instead, where the lyric theme once was, there's now a breezily charming, fast Viennese waltz, the waltz theme. If this is the figurative garden, it now seems less enclosed and enchanted, and more like the setting for a garden party of the chattering classes. While the lyric was in the chromatic median, based on the major third above the key of the movement. This parallel experience, the waltz theme, is also in a key a chromatic third away, but this time built on the minor third. If we had followed the first movement pattern exactly, we would have come to the home key of C major, and this is not a place our protagonist is yet ready to return to. Like the lyric, the theme uses an umpar rhythm in the left hand, an octave texture, and the version of the dactyl rhythm from the opening theme of its movement. And melodically it follows the up and down followed by leap shape from the continuation of the lyric. This shape is also fundamental to the Pastoral, of course, which filled in the leap with a scale, and the second iteration of this waltz sentence moves to a left-hand pattern that evokes the original accompaniment of the Pastoral. This theme then has a kind of hybrid derivation from both the lyric and the Pastoral, and is therefore a commentary on the second subject area as a whole. This is not the second subject area of old. And as this light theme comes to an end, our musical protagonist seems to protest angrily with a double forte variation of the theme sequenced upwards by step, the dactyl motifs and arpeggios swapping hands. This culminates in the return in varied form of the diminished passage that brought us here, as we turn our backs on the C-flat major waltz theme and sequence upwards twice, the second time coming to that augmented sixth on F-flat again, that doorway back to A-flat major. The flat 6 moves to the dominant E-flat, which then alternates with A-flat minor chords around a semitone axis, over an E-flat pedal in both the bass and inner part, prolonging the dominant as we return to where we began the movement, the Presto theme in A-flat major, that C-flat in the A-flat minor chord rising a semitone to the major C natural. The Presto theme continues the same way as before, though double piano rather than double forte, one small difference being that the F-flat major 7 chord that approaches the augmented sixth is played as chords rather than as the oscillating arpeggiation we heard the first time. And another difference being that whereas in the first iteration of the theme the augmented sixth resolved directly onto the dominant E-flat major chord, this time it progresses to a 6/4 chord before resolving onto the dominant E-flat. At this point the first time around we had a long and stormy episode that took us to the waltz theme. This time, however, we simply have a repeat of the cadential 6/4 formulation, a pause, and then the waltz theme returns, not this time in C-flat major, but instead the same key as the Presto theme, A-flat, a final pianissimo glance at where the lyric theme used to be. And then, in this perfect cadence, a double forte slamming shut of the door. In the first movement, the next and final theme was the pastoral theme, the idyllic embodiment of halcyon days. Now in this parallel movement, we get a variation of the pastoral, slowed down and a tone below in D flat major. The key of D flat major, the subdominant of A flat and a step away from the tonic of the fantasy, C, is of course significant. This was the key, along with its enharmonic minor, C sharp minor, that formed the bulk of the brooding Adagio second movement. In the context of the work as a whole, it's a key of alienation and mourning, and the theme that follows, which we will call the Lullaby theme, sounds to me like a sad but resigned farewell to the second subject area, a putting to rest of the dreams of the past, and an acceptance that it is time to move on. If we set this theme side by side with the pastoral, the derivation of the lullaby melody from the pastoral is very clear. We have the approaching dactylic idea that morphs into the up and down motif, and then that rise of a fourth, a pattern that then repeats. The similarities continue as the theme proceeds to trace the same harmonic and melodic contours of the pastoral theme. Harmonically, we have the same alternation of dominant and tonic harmony. Melodically, we have the up and down motif down a tone, followed by a drop of a fifth. And this idea then repeats in the same way. The continuation is formed from the equivalent part of the pastoral, an octave displacement creating an up and down motion, followed by the scale continuing downwards. This idea progresses via secondary dominance to a half cadence onto an A flat chord. The first part of the lullaby theme then repeats just as the pastoral theme did, led into by a brief iteration of the neighbour note motif from the Adagio theme, which is in itself a contracted version of the up and down idea. In a deviation from the pastoral, the continuation now extends towards F minor, the relative minor of the movement's overall key of A flat, and we shift to a second part of the theme, which takes the form of varied ruminations on the continuation idea, combined with the neighbour note up and down motif, and versions of the semitone movement built upon a sinking bass line. These continuation ideas always remind me of the opening of Liszt's B minor sonata, by the way, particularly this half step at the end. I've analysed the sonata elsewhere on my channel if you'd like to explore further. It was supposedly heavily influenced by the Wanderer Fantasy. In any case, the sinking bass line now comes to hover on a G flat pedal, having travelled through B flat minor, the relative minor of D flat, on the way back to D flat major via another augmented sixth, this time on B double flat, the enharmonic equivalent of the augmented sixth on A, minus the added augmented fourth that took us into the Adagio second movement. The G-flat subdominant harmony is then prolonged as the restless middle section of the lullaby theme settles down into gentle, rocking motifs that prepare the slightly varied return of the first part. With this cadence in D flat, there is a sense that this process of formation and exploration, this Bildung, is now finally complete. That we have now come to terms with the disillusionment harmonically embodied in that semitone above C, variously spelt C sharp or D flat. That we have revisited the thematic regions of the first movement past and found nothing more to learn. We have taken the road less travelled. The keys are major and minor third above the tonic, E and E flat. The key a major third below the tonic, A flat. And the keys a semitone on either side of the tonic C, C sharp and C flat. And we have turned our backs on the traditional keys, G, A minor, F major, E minor, D minor. In the classic Bildungsroman paradigm, there is only one remaining act in the dramatic journey of our hero, the return to the home on which they turned their backs, to take up their place in the world as a now fully formed character, a character shaped by their years of wandering. In this case, home is of course C major, and we start on the final leg of our journey once again with the dactylic motif, shifting via, of course, the semitone motion, and a modulation referencing the flat 2 Neapolitan character of the second movement that take us back to A flat major and the Presto theme. The dactyl and arpeggio motif then alternate over a sequence moving in semitones that returns us to the tremolo motif and its associated chromatic scale that heralds that augmented sixth, now on A flat. This resolves outwards onto a G major chord. A flat is of course the flat 6 of C major, and G is the dominant of C. This time, finally, that restless urge embodied in the tremolo motif is pulling our protagonist not away from home, but towards it, and in the augmented sixth on A flat, they seem to have found the doorway they need to get there. We are thrown into excitement and agitation in the form of a coda that takes the octave leap idea and carries it through a sequence in which the upper line rises in semitones and the harmony rises in a stepwise scale to a D minor chord and second inversion. This stepwise movement is then expressed melodically in the bass, which rises as we summon up the diminished seventh strength and determination to take the final steps over the threshold into C. That threshold taking the form of the same D minor chord, now in root position, which we've circled around but not yet crossed. We launch into a harmonic progression now unambiguously heading towards an arrival in C major, to a massively prolonged and dramatic augmented sixth on that A flat, the flat 6 of C major, which cadences, finally, on the dominant of C. Schubert keeps us waiting a moment longer with this tantalizing pause. And then, at last, in bar 598, we finally arrive back on a cadence in the key we left behind all the way before in bar 32 with that diminished chord, the key that represents home, the key we've been steering away from all this time, the key where we now realize we ultimately belong, C major, and the final movement. This last movement acts as a kind of coda to the fantasy as a whole, at once a summation, a celebration, and a final putting to bed of all of the longings and conflicts that lie at the heart of the piece as a whole. There's only one theme in this movement, the Fugato theme, so called because it's treated in a fugal manner, albeit fairly loosely. The theme is a masterpiece of musical characterization, emerging organically from all that has gone before, and encapsulating the maturation of a musical personality shaped by the thematic, motivic, and harmonic elements encountered on their journey. The first 8.5 bars constitute the Fugato subject, which Schubert has assembled from the same motivic ideas on which the entirety of the work is founded. It begins, of course, with a version of the Wanderer figure, that's then sequenced up a step before a continuation. The relationship to the opening heroic theme is thus clear, but there's also an internalization of the lyric theme here. We have the same octave figuration in the same rhythm, leading to the same semitone rise, the same up and down linking structure, albeit an elaborated version in this iteration of the lyric, and the same repetition up a step. If we then compare the second half of the Fugato with that of the lyric, we see that we have the same pattern of a dactyl, reversed in the lyric's case, followed by a leap, to a dotted crotchet followed by a quaver, a pattern that then repeats down a semitone, and is then followed by 2 groups of 4 quavers, built on a descending step, which lead to the 4th filled in with a scale that ended the lyric theme, and is one of its most characteristic features as we discussed at the time. As well as the first and second subject areas, the theme also incorporates the diminished 7th, which comes in this extremely prominent diminished 7th leap, which is in fact the very same C# to B flat 7th that set us off on our journey in bar 32, and was referenced enharmonically to take us into the waltz theme in movement 3. And when the answer on the right hand repeats the subject up a 5th, starting on G, is accompanied by a counter subject formed of scales that rhythmically recall the arpeggio idea at the end of the subject, and more importantly in its latter part, the oscillating rhythm of the tremolo as it inverts the intervals of the subject. This is then followed by a 1-bar codetta consisting of a varied inversion of the final bar of the answer, and then the return of the subject in the upper voice, again entering in the tonic key of C major, accompanied by a version of the counter subject. Finally, we have the same thing inverted, with some thickening of the texture in the counter subject. So despite a great deal of chromaticism in the harmony, the theme has entered in C major each of the 4 times that it occurs, a deviation from fugal practice that suggests that Schubert is making a point. That point is surely that we are in C major now, and this time it is a place we are determined to stay. The Fugato theme is thus the culmination of the musical life we've been following. It incorporates the diminished 7th, the tremolo, the first subject, the second subject, and all of the motivic elements whose ebb and flow and metamorphosis have made up the musical consciousness of the piece. We've seen the protagonist brash and immature in the heroic theme. We've seen them tender and enchanted in the second subject area. We've seen them in the depths of despair in the Adagio. And in the Presto movement, we saw them return to the scene of the first and come to terms with that despair, and disillusionment. Finally, in the Fugato theme, we see an embrace of the here and now, of what we are and have become, an older and wiser musical self that embodies and encompasses the totality of its past, the scars as well as the joys, at peace with itself and with the world it rejected. Now Schubert is going to confront us with the forces that have played such a part in our development. The diminished seventh, the augmented sixth, the tremolo, the siren call of E major, a battalion of spies to see whether this mature musical character is indeed the finished article ready to settle down in C major, or whether we will once again be enticed away from our tonic home in search of imagined greener pastures. We begin then with the diminished seventh. It is of course the very same diminished chord that imposed itself at the equivalent point of the opening heroic theme, that assertion of the will that led to our leap of faith towards E major and the lyric theme. The question is how our protagonist is going to respond to the same situation this time. Will they resist the pull away from C major, or will they once again chase the dream? In the bass, we have phrases built out of the leitmotif from the middle of the Fugato subject, and rounded off by the same turn structure that ushered in the transition to the lyric theme in the first movement. We come to an augmented sixth on G, our second test. This draws us into the entirely unexpected and distant key of B minor, a semitone away from C. Are we letting ourselves be drawn away from home again? From B minor we descend the scale, leading to a tonicization of G, the dominant of the tonic key. This process is then repeated down a third to arrive at E minor. So far no key other than C major has managed to achieve stability in this movement, and E minor is no exception as we climb back up the scale using motifs from the counter subject and subject via that same augmented sixth to the B minor chord, from which we this time tumble away in a circle of fifths progression above a bass line descending in semitones to the ominous tremolo we now recognize so well, that restless and rebellious instinct we know tends to herald an augmented sixth towards distant keys. This then is the third test of our mettle. Have we truly conquered our urge to roam? The answer comes in the form of this augmented sixth, an augmented sixth based on A flat, the chord on the flat 6 of C major that ushered in this movement and its opening fugato. Rather than looking for a route away from home, away from the tonic, we found the augmented sixth that takes us back. We come through the other side to double forte cadential chords, and we land decisively back in C major and the reassertion of the fugato subject, accompanied by an elaborated form of the counter subject, making extensive use of the tremolo rhythm that, like the diminished seventh and like the augmented sixth, remains a part of us, but no longer holds us in its sway. Finally, it's the turn of the E major chord to tempt our hero. At the point where the fugato was interrupted by the diminished chord the first time around, here it is interrupted by an E chord, the chord to which we had lurched unexpectedly at the end of the very first sentence of the entire piece, the chord that had enticed our protagonist into this long journey in the first place? Are we about to be thrown off course again? The answer comes in the form of this D, which turns the E triad into an E7 chord, a kind of inverted form of the same procedure that we saw at the end of the lyric in the first movement. And we get what feels like the oscillating tremolo that led to the original E chord, now heading away from it in the opposite direction, towards what promises to be a double forte cadence safely in the tonic of C. But this is thwarted by the E chord again attempting to reassert itself, throwing us once more into the tremolo motif. This tussle for the cadence between C and E culminates in a series of dactylic variations as C major calls upon the A-flat augmented sixth and that semitone motion in the bass to bring us back to that cadential formulation in C major again. But the tussle is not yet over. As the dominant is prolonged and the final part of the fugue subject, accompanied by an elaboration of the final part of the counter subject, again utilizing that tremolo rhythm, is sequenced 3 times, until again we get to a cycle of descending fifths. And it is this time, finally, that the argument is settled once and for all. We enter a C major cadential progression that lands unambiguously on a perfect cadence in C major. We have, it is now clear, mastered our desires and our demons. We've steered between the harmonic rocks and stayed our course. We are definitively and happily home. This time we are in C major to stay. The remainder of the movement is a celebration of this C major arrival, a kind of final curtain call in which all the players come on stage for a bow. We begin with a sequence based on the middle of the Fugato subject, accompanied by cascading arpeggio motifs. The C-sharp diminished seventh chord then enters the stage, now no longer a threat to the C major status quo. The parts reverse with the dactyl motif now above and inverted, heading downwards instead of up, and the arpeggios below also inverted. This alternates with G7 chords to bring us to another iteration of the C major cadential formulation, and a piano repetition of the preceding sequence. This time when we get to the diminished seventh chord, however, we slip not to G7, but to another diminished seventh built on the note a semitone above, G sharp, the beginning of a series of diminished chords built on a chromatically ascending bass line that takes us once again to the dominant. We drop to piano for the tremolo motif, entering hand in hand with the A-flat augmented sixth, as they take us through a 2-bar phrase built on another repeating cadential formulation in C, musing on the scale and step motifs. We repeat up the octave, crescendoing to forte and the start of what looks like another repetition up a further octave. But we go to G rather than G7, and then an alternation of cadential 6/4 and dominant chords, as the bass drops down one octave and then another, and we arrive at a dramatic double forte alternation of tonic and dominant chords at twice the harmonic rhythm, before, 10 bars from the end, we arrive at a huge triple forte cadence in C major, a cadence that will be extended from here until the end of the piece, first reinforced by celebratory versions of the arpeggio motif, then by reassertions of the tonic and dominant, and then by one final bow from the semitone motif and the diminished seventh, which alternates with tonic C chords, to arrive at 3 triumphant assertions of the victorious C major triad. Even if Schubert had written nothing else, The Wanderer Fantasy would still be enough to secure his place in musical history. It's one of the most intricately constructed pieces in the repertoire, an infinite Russian doll of a work. It's a single movement that's also 4. It's a theme and variations where the themes are the variations. It's a sonata that's also a concerto, that's also a fantasia, that's also a rondo. It's a harmonic room of mirrors where the larger harmonic shifts are reflections of changes at the smallest level. It's a 720-bar world in an 8-bar grain of sand. And above all, it is a powerful musical story of hope, fallibility, hubris, and redemption that, for all its astonishing technique and intellect, seems to speak directly to the heart. So well done if you've managed to make it to the end of this video. That's an achievement in itself. I hope you found it helpful. And we'll finish with that epic C major conclusion, the return home of the prodigal motifs and the culmination of one of the greatest solo piano works ever written.